Minis are something we see a heck of a lot of here at Manor Park Classics, and frankly, we aren't complaining. Give us as many of these cutesy little fellas as humanly possible. In fact, the room to my left is known as the mini room here, partly because it's always full of minis, but also because, well, only really minis can fit through that gap. But this month, for our September auction, we only have one mini saloon. That's very, very unusual. The more astute of you will have already noticed that behind me is a moke, endearing in totally its own way. But this is the only mini saloon we have, and fortuitously so, this is a 1995 single-point injection Rover Mini Cooper. And that allows me to tell you all another story, to go down another rabbit hole of old British engineering and talk about how Rover planned to replace the Mini in the early 1990s. You see, the Mini, as a mainstream small car, was essentially dead and buried as of 1980 as it was replaced by the Austin Metro. Mini sales fell off a cliff in 1980, never ever to recover. And instead, through that decade, it was sold as a bare-bones economy car. People only really bought Minis because they were one of the cheapest cars that you could buy, one of the cheapest four-wheel forms of transport available. And this made a lot of sense. After all, it was a size smaller than the Metro, so they just kept it ticking over. But they imagined that by 1986-87, the Mini would slowly die off, no fanfare, and we'd move on with our lives. However, as it turns out, people started to cotton on to the Mini as a brand new classic car. People started to view it with its grey bumpers, its steel wheels, and its grey interior as a canvas. A blank canvas from which to start work and modify into a cafe racer of sorts. Rover started to realise this, and fortuitously again, it came at a time when Rover was re-evaluating itself. Austin Rover, as they were known in the 1980s, weren't making consistent profits. They were essentially nationalised at that point, and so this was national news. They weren't doing so well with the Metro, Maestro and Montego against the likes of Ford and Vauxhall, and so they had a rethink and came up with a policy known as Roverization, whereby the group would move upmarket, renaming itself simply as the Rover Group, and would try and sell cars to higher profit levels, to charge a premium for cars that would have better styling, that would have better detailing, that would have slightly better engineering than their Ford and Vauxhall counterparts. We're not talking BMW, Mercedes-Benz here, we're just talking that little bit above the mainstream. Premium mainstream is what Rover were going for. And in doing so, the Mini was the absolute perfect candidate for that. At the end of the 80s and into the 90s, Rover started offering tuning kits for standard 1-litre Minis. But in 1990, they launched as a limited edition at first, a new Mini Cooper. This was the first Mini Cooper in nearly 20 years, and with it came a white roof, white stripes, fog lamps on the front, alloy wheels, stripes down the side, and a half-leather interior even. The Mini Cooper was big news, and people were willing to pay for it. The Mini was now making more money per car than it ever had before, suddenly because Rover were realising that this was a niche, but a profitable niche at that. Therefore, they turned their attention towards realising that, yes, the Metro exists. Yes, nobody's going to buy a Mini instead of a Metro or a Fiesta, but the Mini lives a life of its own within this niche, and really, we shouldn't just throw it away. And so they started working on replacing it in 1992, but starting with the same body shell as they'd always had before. This project was known internally as Minky, and you can probably tell that that is Mini with a K in it. And if you know anything about Rover, you'll kind of know where this is going, because the K stands for the K-Series engine, introduced to Rover's mainstream passenger cars in 1989, including the thoroughly revised and re-engineered Rover Metro. Now, it's fashionable to say, they rebadged it, you fool. After all, that's a great starting point. However, you'd have to be a stylist to take that seriously, because the K-Series Rover Metro was essentially a new car underneath. Yes, it had its new K-Series engine, but it had thoroughly revised, beefy, double wishbone front suspension. It had beefier trailing arms at the back. It was far more refined, and it had properly interlinked hydrogas suspension, removing the bounciness, removing the pitching of the original Metro, turning it into the best small car in the world. Now, they're not my words. Again, I'm doing a partridge here. They're not my words. They are the words of Autocar magazine, who in 1990 drove the K-Series engine Rover Metro and said just that. They said it had a better engine. They said it had better ride and handling than even the Peugeot 205. So what better place to start from in creating a new Mini? That K-Series engine has its gearbox on the end, rather than having its gearbox underneath like the traditional A-Series in the Mini had. And therefore, when they came to fit it, they realised Mini isn't really big enough to fit a 4-cylinder K-Series engine in it. So that brand new, all-alloy, tremendously well-engineered engine was sliced. And instead, we had a 3-cylinder, twin camshaft, fuel-injected K-Series engine stuffed under the bonnet of a Mini with its gearbox on the end. In one fell swoop, therefore, we've enormously improved the refinement and the performance of the Mini. Then they decided that they were going to take the suspension from the K-Series Metro, related tenuously as it is to the original Minis, and fit that underneath this car. They had to cut up the front subframe quite a lot, and the rear subframe was a kind of mix and match of Mini and Metro bits. But in the end, they ended up with a Mini, all 10 feet and 1/4 of an inch of it, exactly the same size as they started, but with a K-Series engine, double wishbone, beefy double wishbone front suspension, and hydrogas suspension. Now, hydrogas suspension was Rover's very, very clever fluid and gas interlinked suspension system, meaning a Metro didn't have any coil springs, nor did it have any traditional telescopic shock absorbers. Instead, it had these units that were filled at the top with very high pressure nitrogen gas, had a series of diaphragms, and were damped with hydroelastic fluid. That hydroelastic fluid stayed independent side to side, but it was linked from the front corner to the back corner. And that meant that hydrogas cars could kind of anticipate the road. As the front wheel hit a bump, it would make the rear end react. It would keep it from pitching and diving, and the properties meant that when you enter a corner, it stiffens up. You have a very, very plush ride in a straight line, but when you want firmness to come in, it just does, with no dramas. Now, hydrogas is a development of the old hydroelastic suspension, which rather than having the gas in it, had standard rubber cones doing the springing. And I say standard because when the Mini was introduced in 1959, it was designed for hydroelastic, but wasn't given the privilege, because hydroelastic wasn't yet ready, and so the Mini traditionally was fitted with rubber cones and telescopic shock absorbers beside them. That led to brilliant handling characteristics, the characteristics we all know and love these little cars for, but it led it to a very, very firm ride. Minis are known as kind of bouncy castles on wheels as a result, but in 1962, hydroelastic was ready. It was fitted to the Mini's bigger brother, and in '64, it came along to the smaller car. So why are we left in the 90s, lauding the introduction of hydrogas? Well, that's because all the Monte Carlo Minis, the vast majority of original Mini Coopers, had hydroelastic. They all performed brilliantly with that suspension system, but as British Leyland, as they were then known, was nearing oblivion, they took all the good stuff out. They stripped the hydroelastic suspension out of the Mini, replacing it with the original rubber cones in order to save a little bit of money. And so this car, a 1995 Mini Cooper, has those standard rubber cones. Anyway, we fast forward back to Minky and we have hydrogas suspension under the Mini. Its fantastic fluid damping system was back under the Mini for the first time in 21 years, really. And so we are left with a Mini, not only with better refinement thanks to its engine, but much better comfort thanks to its suspension. We have a Mini that now you could drive and not feel too tired in. A Mini that would stand up to the modern rigour of the Super Mini class. And although it was still absolutely tiny, they transformed it mechanically. Then, just to round things off, they decided to attack the interior. Now, if you've ever driven a Mini, you'll know that it's not exactly comfortable. You kind of sit above the steering wheel. And so to fix that, they gave it the steering column from a Rover Metro. Again, makes sense, great economies of scale. So it would sit at a normal, more normal car position. They then fitted extended runners to the seats so you could sit further back and have a more reclined, more normal, less sit up and beg driving position. Yes, that would turn it into a 2+2, but frankly, people are buying these cars because they were cool by the 90s. People didn't care so much about rear legroom. However, they did give it more practicality by fitting a tailgate to the back. The Mini now had a hatchback for the first time, replacing that silly fold-down saloon little chute you have in the back. Also giving it fold-down rear seats, and for a little bit of safety, they decided to remove the rear corner-mounted fuel tank right next to the rear lamp cluster, so that, if you roll the Mini, it catches fire. They moved it into the void beneath the rear seats. All very sensible upgrades that were a big deal to do on a very old shell, but as a product, as an entire, brand new product of itself, it could stand on its own as a new Rover product for the 1990s. We therefore have a refreshed Mini, still 10 feet, should I say, and 1/4 of an inch, but with all that added comfort, practicality, performance, etc. But as the Mini was still selling respectably enough, and Rover didn't really have all that much money, they canned it. They scrapped Minky. They took the car and removed any display of its existence was wiped from the earth. It was gone. And Rover just carried on, as they were, oblivious, pretending that the Mini didn't need to be replaced. After all, they could just keep it humming along until safety regulations finally got the better of it. The Metro was selling well enough, but of course they had new models in the wings, much more important models that were a heck of a lot easier to build than the Mini. In 1994, however, Rover was bought out by BMW. And BMW saw Rover as a potential cash cow in two departments because they, of course, had Land Rover and Mini. They saw these two as within the wider Rover group building some, not particularly desirable cars, a company that doesn't have a great reputation, that is struggling to move past the 70s and 80s. They saw Land Rover and Mini as the saviours. So they turned to Rover's engineers in 1994 and said, "So what have you been doing about creating a replacement for our cute little friend?" And the Rover engineers all kind of shook their heads and said, "I'll be back with you very shortly." They panicked, essentially. Rover panicked, thinking they were going to embarrass themselves immediately to their new German overlords, having just left a really profitable marque to just wither. And so they went away and they got another Mini shell. They decided to recreate Minky again, but this time they had to make it work. The original Minky existed, but it was a prototype, it was a concept, it didn't actually work. That 3-cylinder K-series was literally just slice a cylinder off the front. We don't actually need to make it run or anything, it just sits here as a showpiece. Minky 2, as this new car then became known, did have to run. And so they couldn't fit that 4-cylinder K-series under the front of the Mini. But they thought, that's a good excuse to make the Mini a little bit bigger. Not to make it ridiculously big, not to make it modern Mini size, but just to give it a bit more elbow room. And so they sliced the shell, the donor shell they'd got, down the middle and in half. And therefore they expanded it by 50 millimeters each way, leading us to a Mini that kind of looks wrong. But you can't figure out why it looks wrong until you're told, because it's just that little bit bigger. The proportions are just slightly altered. Styling, however, remains exactly as it was. They then fitted it with that 4-cylinder K-Series engine, all 1400 cc's worth and over 100 brake horsepower in it. Must have made it really, really fly. Then, of course, they gave it the hydrogas suspension. They didn't give it a hatchback or a changed fuel tank position. They just wanted to make it run, to show the BMW engineers that they'd done something with it. BMW were really very impressed with what came out. After all, the K-Series Metro drove so well, you take a little bit of weight out of it, take a little bit of size out of it, and it's only going to drive even better. And so, having tuned the setup a little bit more, BMW went away impressed. But of course, it wasn't really going to happen. Euro NCAP was only round the corner, and yeah, even producing the Mini past NCAP was a struggle. They did through to 2000, but a slightly widened and lengthened Mini, it just wasn't going to happen. It was an interesting thought process. It was an interesting prototype to show what could be done within the confines of the original Mini shell. This led to Rover and BMW working together on an all-new Mini replacement. They didn't know initially whether it was going to look like this, whether it was going to be a stylish kind of 2+2 Mini in the Cooper gist of things, or it was going to be a Mini as in an economy car. Rover wanted an economy car. Rover wanted something clever, something different, something novel, but BMW kind of wanted minky. BMW realised that the Mini brand was all about this style. It was about the pedigree that it gave, and therefore, that's what won out. The all-new car that was developed was co-engineered between Rover and BMW and launched in 2001 as the R50 Mini. And throughout a lot of that car's development, it was imagined that it would have hydrogas suspension, and until very late, it also had a K-Series engine. So that's an interesting little tale of how the Mini could have been reborn in the early 1990s. How Rover's mad engineers decided they were going to take this antiquated shell and just do something different, do something mad with it. So if you would like this little fella, complete with its original A-Series engine, rubber cone suspension, none of that excess of minky, then do follow the link in the description and come and have a look at this little Mini Cooper for yourself. But yeah, I hope you all enjoyed that story time and you didn't get too bored by it. But that is the story of Minky.